Welcome back everybody to me talking about books and stuff, and this is not a Wheel of Time video for today. No, this is a bit of a generic one. So buckle in because I feel this has to be talked about. Let's talk about problematic authors and problematic parts in books and how to deal with that, shall we? Cheers. Alright, so this may have a few kind of spoilers, but I'll try to keep it as spoiler-free as possible. So those of you who have watched my Wheel of Time videos, my Eye of the World videos of last week, kind of probably know the context that made me talk about this today. If not, let me lay it out. So I've just reread the Eye of the World. It's the only Wheel of Time book I've read so far. I'm going to start The Great Hunt on Monday. We'll see how that goes. However, while reading that book, I came across a few things that I did not agree with. And those were things outside the writing. Now, don't get me wrong, I had enough issues with just the writing, pacing, and whatnot, but they're like two depictions of characters, or a group of characters, a culture, so to speak, that I had issues with, lots of issues with, because I felt they were stereotypical in a harmful way. And I voiced one of those in a Discord server, the Unabridged Burners Discord server, which you all should join because it's the best Malazan Discord server out there, and a lot of other things as well. Anyway, and someone was like, oh, I did not notice that when I read it, whenever, and then the word is like, I'm afraid to reread this because it may destroy my nostalgic feelings, and also, can't we actually read anything without it being problematic anymore? And that's sort of what made me think about this. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll still call this stuff out every single time I find it, because I'm that kind of person. And I like yelling at stuff. No, but it made me think about the whole mess. And we've spoken about this before last year when there was that whole brouhaha around Steven Eriksson's stuff in Toll the Hounds, or maybe other stuff as well. And I want to go at this again as how do we deal with problematic authors, and how do we deal with problematic, always, parts of books, and maybe how to avoid this becoming too personal. That's sort of the goal for this exercise for today. So I'll try to structure it. We'll talk about problematic, so to speak, problematic authors first, and then we'll talk about problematic content, so to speak, problematic content, and then I'll try to end it and sum it all up, and we'll see how that goes. I'll probably name some names in this video, so I want to do the first thing here first, and we'll come back and come around to that later on. I will name some authors and stuff, and if you personally enjoy any of their works and all of that, please be aware that I am not calling you out for liking that stuff. That's not my goal here, and you're absolutely valid for enjoying those books, having fond memories of those books, all of that stuff. That's the point. You're all valid for doing that. No problems with that. I'll just drop some names where I personally have issues with. So this is me personally finding some examples that I have. You may have very, very different ones depending on your politics, morals, and whatnot, and I'm not judging you for those at this point. I think I've made it very clear where my politics usually are, so you can probably guess which kind of authors I'm going to call out here, or which kind of books or whatever I'm going to mention here, but I feel what I'm saying here is valid for all different politics at the end of the day. I obviously think that mine are the correct politics, but that's in the nature of the game, right? So let's look at all of that. Alright, the first thing that we need to understand is times change. Humans change over time, societies change over time, and our values, societal values, moral values, and so forth change over time, as does our knowledge and all these other things. Things that were acceptable or standard, scientific standard a century ago are no longer scientific standard, for example. all these things, right? It's like we no longer believe that we're living on a flat Earth. I hope so, and that we're orbiting the sun. Well, we're believing that, but the sun is no longer orbiting our like disk of a world and shit like that. We change over time. That's what I'm saying here, and that's fine. However, what that means is that some of the people whose work we're looking at are like worse, subscribing to completely different worldviews than we are now. It's like, take the granddaddy of all like modern physics, Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. He believed in alchemy. He was not his philosophy, his religion, his theology, all of that stuff is far away from like modern consensus. And that's fine, because what we're looking at is his physics, and those, I guess, mostly still work, at least for like people in maximum high school, I guess. So we're fine there. Different stuff like that. It's like, as soon as we are like looking at art or science or whatever, as soon as we're looking at stuff that is created outside our own time, which on time frames, depends on what you're looking at, but right now, with things moving so quickly these last decades, I guess it probably felt like that to every human being ever. It's like, yeah, the times are moving super quickly, but like when you look at like the last couple of, say, last 20 years, our discourse on topics like race and gender has shifted incredibly far. And I personally think that's great. We finally talk about issues like transgender. Well, not issues. We finally, at least some of us, come to the realization that gender is more of a flexible term than our parents, our grandparents might have thought. In the mainstream, right? That's sort of what I'm saying here. But those discourses have changed. We have finally realized that consent is actually a really good thing to have when talking about human interactions. That was not exactly mainstream consensus, unfortunately, at least not explicitly consensus 20 years ago for all kinds of reasons. And that's good. However, it means that if we look at something that was created 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, those people were operating under very, very different parameters. So judging them according to our own standards leads to all kinds of problems. Now, should we give them a pass for everything? Of course not. But maybe we should like also put some context in those things. So I'll, look at stuff for a bit here. And first we're looking at authors that voice problematic or absolutely intolerable opinions and have political views that, or like whatever, views in general that we will not and cannot subscribe to. Let's start with a book that I personally absolutely recommend you all go and read. That's just Don Quixote. Don Quixote is unfortunately a couple of centuries old. And you find stuff in there that, where things have changed. Oh, also I should not have picked Don Quixote yet, because this is more about content. Sorry, I'm disorganized. Let's go back. Let's look at authors. Let's look at Robert Irvine Howard, one of my favorite authors of all time. He was a strapping young Texan in the 1930s. He was rather conservative, but he subscribed to ideas of mostly, like when it comes to racial issues, that were sort of still, unfortunately, accepted as science at the time. So there's stuff in there that we need to, that I find absolutely reprehensible, that I have an issue with, and I'll always call him out for that. Look at his buddy, a pen buddy at least, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. The guy was a card-carrying racist, unfortunately. And you find that. And I've picked those two for right now, and then I'll pick another one, and that is, I guess, Orson Scott Card for later stuff. Now, here's the issue. Robert E. Howard's fiction is infused by his internalized racism. It shows up. He has racial prejudices and racial stereotypes all over his stories. But he kind of stops at that. So, is that egregious? Hell yeah, it is. Does it detract me from reading his stories? Sometimes it definitely does. Do I stop reading his stories? No, I don't. Well, that's the point. It's like I have white privilege. I have no issues with that. I was never in my life the subject of any form of racial discrimination. So it's easy for me to read that stuff, saying like, yeah, well, this is bullshit. I don't believe in that, and move on. For other people, that may vary. Let's look at Howard Phillips Lovecraft for a second here, right? Lovecraft, as I said, was way more into racism. And once again, there's differences when you read Robert E. Howard's detective novellas, short stories. They go in the same direction as the Fu Manchu novels, which is they're racist. And they're using racial stereotypes against Asian people. It's, Zach Romer is a racist in that regard. And the problem that we have with those stories, and that we also have with H.P. Lovecraft stories, is that they are so effective in what they're doing, and it comes across more with Lovecraft, at least for me, because Lovecraft is writing horror stories, and a lot of his horror, not all of it, but a lot of his horror is so effective because it kind of latches on to those subconscious built-in racial stereotypes and whatnot. It is part of what makes his stories so, I don't want to say great because that's the wrong word, but what makes them so effective as horror stories is because he pulls all those subconscious racist levers in our in our brains, and that's absolutely reprehensible. Once again, I totally understand why people of color don't want to read H.P. Lovecraft. It must be fucking painful. If it's not, then more power to you. Go and read it. But if it is, then don't do that stuff, please. And you're absolutely justified and valid, and it's important to call those things out. In particular, it's important to call out that Lovecraft is not only a racist in like his private life, but his racism informs his writing, and that's where we're going to go in the future. Another one, and sort of like the kind of problem that we have where time comes in on the second level, is Orson Scott Card, maybe also J.K. Rowling. I'll just go past those in a bit because both Lovecraft and Romer and Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, they're all dead. If I give them money, so boycotting them does not actually hurt them because they're already as hurt as can be, I assume, because they're dead. What, however, with authors that are still alive, where me buying a book does actually give those people money? Well, that's exactly where the idea of canceling comes in, and where canceling does have some effects. Like, I don't want to give people, don't necessarily want to give people money that I don't agree with. Now, there's different steps in there. I personally am fairly tolerant when it comes to people that disagree with me, but I draw the line where the money that I give those people, it will be used for stuff that I don't agree with, on a visceral level. Thus, Orson Scott Card, who I don't want to buy any books from because he has openly said that he donates part of that money to causes that I violently disagree with, which is conversion therapy and a lot of other homophobic stuff that I think is absolutely damnable. So that guy's not getting any money from me. Does that make his books bad? Probably not. I have not read them, and I will not read them because I don't want to spend money on them. Same with sort of J.K. Rowling. Boycotting J.K. Rowling will probably not have a huge effect because she's already as rich as can be, but those people still profit from us doing that, or suffer from us boycotting them. So there is that level of it as well. But once again, those books, and I have no idea about Harry Potter because I only read the first 3 books as a kid, and probably did not notice any subtext in there that is problematic. However, if I read that stuff as an adult, I'll probably find some. I'm good at finding stuff that makes me angry. It's sort of what I do. So yeah. It's important to be aware of that and draw the consequences that are important there, which is don't give people money you don't agree with if you don't want to do that. Make sure your money goes, your precious little money that you have, I assume, because I don't have any, goes to causes that you support, to people that you support. And try to separate between art and artist where possible. And it's never fully possible. It's like the other side of that is it's never fully possible, and I've spoken about that before. That's sort of where we're going next with this, which is when we're talking about content. So, what if there's stuff in a book that I don't agree with? This is where I draw out Don Quixote. Don Quixote is written in the 17th century. And like 17th, 18th century. What do we learn? Well, there's a shit ton of anti-Semitism there. Now, hating Jews and hating Muslims in 17th, 18th century Spain is basically common sense for those people who are not either Jewish or Muslim. Because there's a lot of, religious and racial tensions going on there. Those people are actively being kicked out of the country at the time. Do I approve of these things? Of course not. They're absolutely terrible and, all of that. But it would be very wrong of me to expect anything to expect nothing of the sort in a book of that time. It's the same thing that we go further on in time with Mark Twain and the whole Huckleberry Finn discussion, right? This book and Don Quixote as well are at this point not only works of literature, works of fiction that we read to entertain ourselves. And trust me, Don Quixote is highly entertaining and you should all go and read that book. Maybe it was also a bit more egregious in my case because I don't speak Spanish, but I read a translation by Tobias Smollett from 17-something. So 18th century translation, where, moral values and language in also English were pretty fucking rough as well when it comes to hating Muslims and hating Jews. Stuff that you would not find in a contemporary, probably not find in a contemporary translation. I have not read one, so I don't know. Point, however, is those are documents of a specific time. And by reading those texts, we can get all the information, or all the knowledge, all the benefits of reading good fiction. But we also can get knowledge of the times, the environment of the author. That is something that is, unfortunately, because history is usually pretty fucked up, and as humans, we're not exactly better people 200 years ago than we are now. We probably were fucked up about different things back then, but it's still it's not always a pleasant thing that we learn, but we learn something from reading stuff like that. So that's why you have that stuff in there, and why I think it's important to keep at least one version of those texts, of those original texts around to study that kind of stuff. Does it have to be like the direct word-to-word translation for everyone all the time? Hell no. You can cut the anti-Semitism from Don Quixote and still have a fantastic book for entertainment purposes. But the original should be available somewhere. Also, I will not go out and cancel Cervantes for what he wrote back then, because he didn't know any better. And as far as I know, he was not particularly anti-Semitic compared to his countrymen at the time. But I didn't, study Spanish history that much. All right, anyway, so moving forward, we come to, once again, people like Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, like the 1930s. You still find a lot of racial stereotypes, at least in Lovecraft's case, employed very consciously. With Howard, I'm not so sure. Probably when it comes to his detective stories and his anti-Asian stereotypes and hatred, it feels more personal and active there. With Lovecraft, it's more all kinds of other groups, ethnic groups that he really hates. I mean, he basically hates everyone except white Caucasians, but, My point is, there I feel it's important. I mean, and it's always important to point that out. It's important to point out the anti-Semitism in Don Quixote. It's important to point out the racism against people of color in Mark Twain. It's important to point out the racist stereotypes in Robert E. Howard, in H.P. Lovecraft. It's important to do that wherever we find it. But once again, those are still also documents of their time. Now we move, and this is sort of where we come to that, it's sort of a sliding scale, I feel. We come to, say, the 1980s. The 1990s. I read Wheel of Time. It was published in 1990. Jordan started writing in 1984. And there I find highly problematic anti-Semitic and anti-Zigonist stereotypes in there. Do I accuse Robert Jordan of doing this consciously and on purpose because he's a racist? I don't think so. But do I hold him a bit more accountable for it than I do someone 200 years ago? Yes, I do, because we kind of knew that it's not a good idea to, like, anti-Semitism was something that we were aware of, a broad term, and so forth, right? It was no longer accepted to hate Jews in the 1980s, I hope. On like a broad mainstream kind of thing, you know, outside of, say, Iran, maybe, you know, that's sort of where I'm going with this. So it's even more important to call it out there, because we need to call it out every single time we encounter these things, because otherwise this stuff will not change. What we see with someone like Robert Jordan, I'm sorry for dragging him out, because, I mean, it's just what I've read today. Not today, but, you know, yesterday and the day before and so forth. And there's another author that I also drag into this right now, which is Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett puts in some of those stereotypes in his earlier Discworld novels. And Terry Pratchett is definitely someone who he's one of my favorite authors. He's probably my favorite author of all time, outside of, obviously, the guy who wrote Winnie the Pooh. But my point is, a lot of these stereotypes, racial stereotypes, are deeply ingrained. Which is why when Robert Jordan needs a traveling merchant who's a bit shifty, he thinks of him, like, visualizes him as having a hooked nose and some other traits that are sort of like anti-Semitic stereotypes. Without ever making the connection, and that's sort of the promise, they are deeply ingrained, which is why we need to call them out so people change those ideas and start thinking consciously about what those characters may look like to other people. That's sort of what I'm trying to go with this when I call this stuff out. And as I said, Terry Pratchett has some quite bad takes in his early books there as well. There's those river traveling people in Equal Rights. There's certainly an amount of, like, positive stereotypes, but still stereotypes in, say, Witches Abroad when it comes to people of color, and voodoo as a religion. There's some really bad takes on sort of a parallel to Native Americans in the spirit of, I don't know. I keep forgetting his name. The spirit in Reaper Man. And those are terrible, and those need to be called out. They were not actually, I think that's sort of where we see how social acceptance changes and how awareness changes. Those things are not there because those people were racist. They were there because that stuff was acceptable and at the times. If those things make you personally uncomfortable and you don't want to read that, then it's always fine to not read that stuff. That's absolutely your prerogative, and please go ahead and do that. Which leads us to that third part of what I wanted to say today, and that is, how do we deal with these kind of things? And I've already spoken about that, but I want to talk about two sides of that. One of them is how we personally should react when we find things like that in books that make us uncomfortable, that don't, like, work with our personal, like, our current, like, moral, political, or whatever views. Then we should definitely call these things out, point them out. It's important because, as I said before, if we don't point those things out and just, like, sweep them under the rug, those stereotypes, those problems will persist. They will remain in our, collective subconscious, and they will be dragged up again and again and again whenever someone decides to write a book. No one would like. I think no one should want that for the future, because just because we've always done it that way is a terrible argument for just about everything. No, we should question everything, figure out why we have done things in a specific way, and then move on. Otherwise, we would still eat all our meat raw, and dig our latrine pits next to the village well, which is incidentally directly next to the fucking graveyard. No, we don't do that thing. We question. We move forward. We do that in all our lives, with everything. So we should also do it with art. We should also do it with books. Figure out why stuff is there, and then change what we think should be changed, and keep what we think is worth keeping. And maybe in 10 years, something that we right now thought was totally fine to keep will no longer be fine. And you know what? That's great, because in the long run, it will make us all better people. And that should sort of be the goal, right? So now let's look at the other side of this, which is sort of what prompted me wanting to talk about this. And this is like, aren't we allowed to have fun anymore? Short answer, yes we are. Now the long answer. And here we need to talk about how we interact with art. And that is art and consuming art, whether it's music or books or theater or movies or any other form of art, is part of our personality. It's part of our identity. And that's where the problems start. Or not start, but that's sort of where the problems are located right now. So every single book I read changes me as a person. Every single song I listen to, at least consciously listen to, changes me as a person. I like it. Awesome. I hate that song. Also awesome because it defines me. It helps define that vague thing that we always try to figure out, which is like, who the fuck am I? And apart from a lot of other things, it's also, I'm a person who loves Terry Pratchett, who loves heavy metal, and who loves the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I'm also a person who does not like the Eye of the World as a book so far. I'm a person who really, really, really dislikes A Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. There's other stuff in there. But the experience of reading, of listening, is tightly connected to all kinds of other aspects of my life. I'll give you an example. It's like one band that I loved to listen to, that was very much important, formative for me getting into heavy metal, was Iced Earth. Now, those of you who already know. Those of you who don't know will find out now. Their main band leader, John Schaefer, moved further and further into right-wing politics of the last decade, culminating in him taking part in the attack on the Capitol last year, just 2 days ago last year. Do you think I'll be able to listen to any Iced Earth song without knowing that, without having that in the back of my mind? And do you know that will not change my perception or my enjoyment of the music? Of course it won't. I can't listen to that stuff in the same way. But, and this is where the aren't we allowed to have fun anymore thing comes in. At the same time, my second heavy metal concert I ever attended, or maybe the third, I'm not quite sure, was an Iced Earth concert in the beginning of 2002, I think, on the Horror Show tour. And they played 3 sets, 3 hours. I was 16 at the time, I guess. And that was one of the most intense experiences of my life, to have a 3-hour concert of one of my at the time favorite bands blasting. That was fucking insane. It's one of the best memories of that time that I have. And at the one hand, what happened later has definitely tarnished those memories. This is sort of where I'm going to get with this. it has tarnished my memories. It struck and it strikes very close to my personal identity, to who I think I am, because I am a person who really, really, really hates all the politics this guy stands for at this point. Maybe he stood for the same kind of politics in 2002. I don't know. A 16-year-old German was not necessarily politically aware. I certainly was not necessarily politically aware enough of all that went on in John Schaefer's mind at the same time to put any judgment there. But it's like there's that disconnect, that inner struggle with me to connect those two kind of things. And that's in there, and that will always happen whenever I find out about anything that I enjoyed a lot, as before, when I find out that there is something that makes this unacceptable or very, very difficult to accept for me. That will always be there. And this is sort of the problem there, right? It means whenever, and this is sort of where we're going with the next bit here, it means whenever someone will call out something that I enjoyed, an author, a band, whatever, my first reflex is to go into defense mode and become really aggressive and defend what I love. I'm known for punching people or threatening to punch people in the face for saying that Iron Maiden is not a relevant band. Yeah, I've done that. I still think I was in the right, but maybe it wasn't, the right reaction in that point. However, and this is sort of where I'm going with this, with another example, and I hope it's fine for me to draw this one up. And this is about Terry Pratchett once again. A while ago, there was a video about Guards by the wonderful booktuber Johanna. She talked about Guards, and one thing she mentioned was that there's only one female character in that book, and she personally felt that was a bit... she felt that was a problem, or she felt uncomfortable or unhappy with that. Unhappy is, I think, the best word there. And she got a lot of comments on, like, mostly guys commenting on that, trying to explain to her why she was wrong in that assessment. And see, the point is, she mentions that in a conversation. I'll try to link it below. She mentions that in a conversation with Brittany and I think it's Angela from the Literary Science Alliance. It's a great chat on like feminism and booktube and stuff like that. And I'll try to link it below if I don't forget. You should definitely go and watch that. And she mentioned it there, and like, I didn't notice back when I watched the Guards video because I had other things that I was angry about, I hope. I have not gone back and checked my comment, but I hope it was only that. But she mentioned it there, and that my first reflex then was like to go and also mansplain to her why she was wrong. And then I sat back, like, no, that's a dumb reaction because that's not what I should do. But I wanted to look at like why that was my first reflex to do. And see, this is once again where I'm going with this. Like, these kind of things make up who we are. I'm a huge Discworld fan. I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan. I think I mostly agree with the kind of things that... I'm also thinking of myself as something of a progressive person when it comes to politics, right? I've never made any secret about this. I'm rather left-wing with most things in my mind, in like politics and whatnot. And I have always felt that reading Terry Pratchett is part of that, because Terry Pratchett in his books over time tackles a lot of these topics, racial issues, gender role issues. He tackles a lot of those things in a mostly progressive way. There's other parts of Pratchett's politics that I don't like, but that's a different point. So when someone tells me that that Terry Pratchett is not, whatever. See, and that's sort of the problem. It's like it was a personal observation, personal feeling, a perception, and those are always valid. But for me, it felt like someone was accusing Terry Pratchett for not being progressive enough when it comes to gender things, to possibly, if I would like go all out mad with it, to maybe accuse him of being misogynist or whatever. And that means that by connection, I personally felt attacked the same way. It's like, you like this anti-feminist author, so you must be an anti-feminist. Like, and that's sort of where like all my fuses burn, and then I go into like mansplain mode, and well, hopefully I didn't, and become extremely aggressive. So this is sort of what I want to point out. Is like it attacks our identity in a lot of ways, even though it's not meant to be. I hope it's not meant to be. Well, in this case, I'm very sure it's not meant to be, but in other cases, I'm not so sure. And this is sort of what I want to draw from this as a lesson at the end of the day. I think it is important for us to point out stuff that we don't agree with in books. Because all books, all art in general is always also political. In the broadest possible sense of what political means. It's political and moral every single time. And if we disagree with something, we need to call it out. However, and this is the other side of it, when we're doing this, while we are doing this, we need to make it clear that this is not a judgment on the character of those who have not also called it out yet. Because there's 100,000 reasons for that. You don't notice every single thing when you're reading something as a 13-year-old. You can read Wheel of Time and be completely unaware of those things, and that's fine. Maybe you read it in the 1990s, and those discussions were far from like as prominent as they are today, so that's also fine. There's 100,000 reasons why other people may not have called out the same kind of things. So it's important for us, when we call out these things, to make clear that this is about the art, this specific aspect of a piece of art, and nothing more. And it's not a judgment on the character of people that have not done the same thing yet. Maybe they'll follow our assessment, maybe they won't. Then we can have us a civilized discussion on why they think otherwise, ideally. On the other hand, when someone calls out a piece of art or an aspect of a piece of art that we very much enjoy, I feel it is important for us to step back, look at what they say, see if it has merit, and be aware of the fact that it is not an attack on our personality, on our identity, and our core beliefs. It usually is not. It should not be. Well, if they're attacking us in our personality, then probably those people are not worth our consideration. We can just ignore them. But always look at those criticisms and see if there's maybe a grain of truth to them, and then reassess our personal involvement, our personal connection to that piece of art and to that specific aspect, to make the world better, to make us better people, like finding out those things, realizing those things, and keeping our good memories as good as possible while moving on to becoming better people is the best way out of this in the future. So yeah, we're still allowed to have fun with stuff. We just need to compartmentalize, I guess. Take out the stuff that sucks and enjoy the good things about it. Enjoy also the good memories we have, the glorious things they brought us, the wonderful time we had while reading it. I don't know, the people that we talked about when we read it for the first time, the people we shared that concert with, those things. That's what makes us appreciate, or like that makes all those nostalgic feelings. It's not so much the actual text. It's very much the time we were in, the people we were with at the same time. And those we can still cherish. Those we should still cherish. And if we manage to do that, then maybe we can have us a civil conversation about art and its problems. That all being said, there's obviously, stuff where that does not apply. That is absolute, contemporary conscious racism, misogyny, any form of that stuff. If people know what they're doing and they're doing it on purpose, and people, on the other hand, people like those things because they have these elements on purpose, then yeah, fuck those people. And then we can call those people out for being assholes. And that's also fine, because that's what we need to do to make the world a better place. And that's why we're all here. Anyway, I hope you have a good Saturday, and I'll talk to you tomorrow about something else. Cheers.